I'm Martin Wheeler, and I'm in Lisbon, in Portugal, and I'm about to be interviewed by Stefan. I can hardly contain myself. I started, I think, when I was about 8 or 9 years old in judo at the local YMCA. The only thing I pretty well remember before that was watching the Kung Fu series with David Carradine, and I got very excited by the idea of martial arts, and then my friend suggested that we go to the judo club, and yeah, I pretty well kind of fell in love straight away with the concept of it. I carried on, my friend left, and yeah, I carried on training, and then I went from there. I trained with that for about a year or so, and then started back up again in martial arts when I was about 15 in Kempo Karate in a local club. I was brought up in the southwest of England, and so there wasn't a lot of martial arts clubs around at the time, but luckily I fell into a good one. And Kempo was a Hawaiian street fighting system developed by Ed Parker, a very famous American Hawaiian martial artist. There happened to be a club right by where I lived, and I studied Kempo for a long time, till into my early 30s from there. And along the way I studied boxing, Thai boxing. I went back to judo and ranked in that in Kentucky actually. I studied Philippine martial arts, Kali, Eskrima, knife and stick fighting, and pretty well anything I could just pick up along the way. I really love martial arts, and so anything excited me. Jiu-jitsu, of course, and yeah, and a bunch of street fighting, which was what I was doing it for. That was where my interest was, from working as a security and bouncing. Yeah, of course. I mean, the more you train in fighting, as long as it's practical training, I mean, the more times you see scenarios that are likely to happen or have happened before, and you have some sort of experience with them, the less your brain has to scramble to try and figure out exactly what to do. I mean, like any art, I mean, it doesn't have to be fighting, but as soon as stress goes up in the reality of what's happening, it's a good idea if you've kind of been at least somewhere like that before. And yeah, the more full contact the art, the better, obviously. That's a hard question.
Because I think sometimes we are grateful, right, from the training we had in the past.
Yes.
It helped us to decode something, even if in the learning process of a new thing.
Well, I think what's important is the learning process. I mean, what I learned at the beginning of the martial arts compared to what I learned maybe 2 years later or 5 years later. I mean, obviously each one of those is going to be a different part of your learning process, and a different part of your, like you said before, confidence in fighting. And I would say the biggest thing I learned from the previous arts probably was being in the fight environment and starting to structure that in a certain way. You have obviously pugilistic sort of like fist fighting, you have grappling in some sort, people wrestling with you, you have ground fighting if you go to the ground, if weapons get pulled, what do you do then? So I think it was probably familiarity with environments. That was probably the biggest part of it, and having some kind of answers to those questions, even though at the time they felt like good answers, they weren't really as complete an answer as I was looking for, I think. Yeah.
And did you have any teacher that had more impact before learning, before reaching to Sistema?
Yeah, a guy called Huck Planis was a big influence over me. He was a Kempo guy.
In what aspect?
Um, I think Huck was the first one to really show me that there's a structure to the martial arts. There's not just techniques, and there's not just being faster or better or stronger, but there was an overall structure to an art that you can start to analyze. And if you analyze that structure and understand, or if you analyze a martial art or any art, could be painting or whatever it is, and you start to see structure in it, then that gives you an opportunity to see structure in other things. And you can kind of start to see structure in boxing, you start to see it in grappling, you start to see it in weapons fighting. So yeah, he definitely gave me a key to understanding how the structure of structures, if you like, that if you can start to really break down not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it, then you can start applying that why to other things.
So you're not talking only about the technical aspect of when you say structure, you're talking about also technicality, right?
Well, technicality is part of the technique, really, but structure is why certain techniques are grouped together, or what. I mean, it may seem fairly obvious when you're doing something more like judo, I guess, where you have certain techniques are tripping techniques, you try and sweep the foot. Certain techniques are throwing techniques, you're going to throw them over your shoulder in some way. Certain techniques are sacrifice techniques, where you're going to throw your body on the ground and use that as a counterweight to throwing them. And so you start to see categorization of techniques, but structure overall is how you start to distill out of those categories what type of general structure you're using overall. So for example, judo, the structure of judo would be to break someone's balance, fit in for the throw, and throw someone. And it doesn't matter what category of technique you're in, you that's the structure, or like the DNA structure of judo. I mean, that's pretty well known within judo. It's not like I didn't come up with that. Boxing would be, your central technique in boxing is probably rotation, so torque in some force. Either your hand is rotating, or your body is rotating, your hip is rotating, your ankle is rotating, your head is rotating in some way. And you're generating power that way. So there's power principles within that structure. And then the larger structure of boxing would be to be able to hit somebody without being hit. So that's kind of like, the internal structure, and then that builds into layers and layers of structure from there as to what you're trying to do. Grappling would be to pin, isolate, break, or choke. So that's probably the internal structure of grappling on the, and again you start to build your layers out from there. Mm-hmm. And Kempo was a little harder to see as a structure, as far as that was concerned, and so he gave me a much better idea as to seeing it as a sort of boxing jiu-jitsu system, and how that applied to to the overall structure of the system. And then, I mean, if I was 15 years old when I started learning Sistema, would I have learned Sistema the same way as I learned full contact systems and things like that? Would I have had the opportunity within Sistema? It depends who was teaching you, to be honest with you. I'm pretty sure if I lived some other reality and had been in Vladimir Vasiliev's training cadre or something, I doubt that I would have got away with not learning it without full contact fighting. So, that would have been a wartime prerogative, I would imagine, and so would I have learned better or worse? I can't say. I think the question is probably, can you learn any martial art without full contact training? I doubt it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that training in that martial art has no value either. So it depends on how you look at it. I think I was around 31. Mm-hmm. I believe it was around 1998, somewhere around there. I'm not very good with numbers, to be honest. I don't really think of time the same way as other people do very often. I don't really pin things on it. pretty sure it was definitely before 2000, and yeah, I ran into Vladimir Vasilyev at a seminar that wasn't a Sistema seminar, it was a Kempo seminar that had been set up in Florida, and Vladimir had been luckily invited to teach at it, and I became very intrigued as to what he was doing.
So
Yeah, I mean, I'd been in Kempo for a long time then, and the other martial arts I did, as much as I loved doing them, all the full contact systems especially, my focus was definitely how they made Kempo better rather than whether I was going to become a boxer or a grappler or something like that. And my only focus with doing Kempo was street fighting. I was very, very interested. I mean, that would be my background as in security. The nightclubs that I worked at were lively, let's put it that way. And so there was a lot of fighting, and outside the clubs, obviously, living in towns where those sort of places happen, then you throw someone out of the club, you're going to run into them the next day. So it was just one of those. I started doing security work or bouncing when I was 17 in England, and did that for a number of years. Had a lot of fun with that. Being, when you're young, there's no shortage of people to figure out how to train with at that stage.
But very different to be a bouncer at that age, and later on, and I imagine in United Kingdom and the States, or
yeah. Well, I moved to America when I was about 25, and I'd been on and off doing the door up until that point in London and places like that. And then when I moved to America, it was an obvious thing to do to make money, and so I did it there. Yeah, it was very different. People didn't fight quite the same way in America as they did in England. They weren't quite as cued in, I don't think, to at the time like street fighting in the same way. But then I was in Kentucky as well, so it was guns and stuff like that were pulled, and so it was a much more dangerous environment in some ways because weapons always exponentially change the environment. But in some other ways, that wasn't so likely to happen. So the other types of fighting were not as dangerous in some ways as well. So it was kind of a mix up. It was all quite fun though. So I can't say I didn't enjoy it.
Well, I imagine fun but scary also.
Oh yeah, it's always. I mean, that's part of the fun. It's like, how you, but also recognizing. I mean, for me, early on, I started to use it as my mother was a research scientist when I was very young, and she later changed to be a translator and then a mother and stuff like that. But I was always interested in science and research, and I'm not a violent person by any stretch of the imagination, and never thought of myself as a tough guy or anything like that. So when I got into all this stuff, especially the door work, it was more experimental to me. It was like, well, what is this? What is violence? Why does it fascinate me? Why is the martial arts important to me? What is this all about? So the working on the door, as much as it supplied me with an income for certain parts of my life, it was always an experiment to me. It was always like, well, how do you apply these martial arts in reality, and how does reality affect your martial arts training, and are they congruent or are they incongruous? Do they line up? Is there just crossover, or can a martial art be the whole thing, or are they totally separate? And then as I got it more into that, one of the things I always noticed about myself, I guess if we're talking about me, which I think helped me with Sistema quite a lot, was when I started getting into it, my mind tends to recognize my internal experience quite well. And so I'm, even as much as I can be locked in my internal experience, I can also have an observational point of view on it. And the more I got into high stress situations and fights and things like that, I was starting to notice how my mind worked or didn't work in those situations, and I became very curious about that. No, I mean, my mother was a research scientist, so I mean, I always knew, and she was always interested in that stuff, even when she wasn't doing it anymore. So there was always.
So in your area, it's.
Oh, she was a biochemist.
Right.
She wrote one of the first books on insulin and things like that. So she was very involved in what she did at the time, and she kind of brought us up that way. Not necessarily to do what she was doing, but she brought us up. I mean, she was the first person that gave me a science fiction book, and the first person to, take me to a museum and and get me interested in science as a. Well, she was also quite a high level gymnast when she was younger as well, and so I had kind of a twin. So I was interested in, very high level physical expression, and very sort of concise sort of mental experimentation, and so I don't think that she would have thought that those two things would have ended up with me now. I doubt that she, if she thought that's what I was going to do, I doubt she would have showed me in the first place at all. So, yeah. I mean, she was, being a bouncer at 17, my parents were, very nice people and quite good standing in the local area, and the bouncer community didn't exactly get awards for being stand-up citizens, so. I mean, I think any artist, if they don't become disillusioned in their art, they're probably not trying hard enough. At some point. I mean, it's not because the art doesn't hold all the answers, it's just that you're not really capable of seeing it, and so there's going to be some kind of dissolution at some point. But also, art is art and reality is reality, and there's a reason that art is a representation of reality to try and access some kind of truth, right? And you can kind of like play with art in different ways, and different artists will do that to try and access some level of truth that they're trying to uncover. But you can't really do that in a street fight because you get your teeth knocked out. So you got to find the things that really work for you, and if you're struggling with, like Kempo, for example, was designed as a multiple attack system, right? And as much practical experience I had with it in street fights, but obviously with boxing and grappling as well, so it wasn't like I just had that. Applying it as it was taught was just not reality. It just didn't work that way. Maybe worked in glimpses and moments or whatever, and I think that was what started to pull me away from a lot of martial arts training in ways, because I just realized that for myself and my experiences, especially when there was multiple people to fight and things like that, there really wasn't anything that could. You could survive the situation and you could do martial arts in it, but you're not doing the martial art that you're trained to do. You can add a piece here, or you might use this, or you might just go, off piste a bit and do something else completely. Because the environment is so chaotic. I literally remember one time being by myself and 5 guys kind of kicked off in a fight with each other, and no one else around, so I figured I'd start peeling them off one by one. I jumped on the back of one, and as I was about to peel them off, they all came towards me. I'm kind of picked up, my feet off the ground, and I'm being pushed backwards. My backs and my legs hit a flat circular table. The table flips up and then flips on top of me, and I'm stuck underneath a round table with the 5 guys fighting on top of the table. Now, I don't really, and I'm kind of laughing at that point because there was nothing I could do, but you can't train for that. There's no kata for the back of the legs hitting the table and being flipped over and being Oreoed underneath it like a sandwich. They just don't have that training. But technically, the Systema does. And I think that's what started to attract me towards it, was the versatility that you don't train Sistema as a martial art and then try and apply it piecemeal into a fight and see if it works. You train it as is, and then that training is what generally the fight kind of looks like. So yeah, it was more realistic to me as to what that really, how your body, your mind, and your fighting spirit combined work together was a more realistic approach than trying to separate into techniques the idea of what the fight might appear like, you know.
And were you still working as a bouncer when you began training Sistema?
Trying to remember, to be honest with you. I think so, on and off. But not very much. I was teaching more by then,
Okay.
you know. But I was kind of moved into teaching police and some SWAT training and stuff like that. And I actually went back and taught security teams like bouncers and stuff. And so I was kind of half involved in it in some way, but yeah. But I think, I mean, the popularity of practical martial arts increased, you know, tenfold. I mean, there's no, you can't, the influence of the UFC over the world is, you can't deny, and, you know, it's been a massive change. I mean, if you got into a fight with somebody when I was a teenager, I mean, if they had some boxing training or some judo or something like that, that was, you know, the most likely thing that you'd run into as a martial artist. But I mean, nowadays, I mean, every 10th person is probably a blue or purple belt in jiu-jitsu or something, or has had some MMA training or something, you know. And if they're in a fight with you, if they haven't, you know, guys that, if they have backed down, or it's hard to say actually, but I think the chances of them having some kind of training is much, much higher, which changes everything. I think the other thing is with the way that viral videos work now, you know, that I think things are a lot more violent quicker, because, you know, if you, like I was in a high volume fight per week type environment, right? But most people are not, their conscious awareness of fighting is not that immediate most of the time. So they're not visually sort of watching fights go down and, you know, how they start and what happens in the middle and what they usually end like on a regular basis. But now, I mean, you know, people can get locked in a TikTok stream and watch fight after fight after fight after fight, you know, and they're much more aware, I think, how violent fights are to be successful, and I think more likely to move into those sort of highly violent stages of the fight much quicker. So I think that's something that, you know, becomes.
But do you think they have a realistic idea of what it is, or do you think there's still people are a bit detached of what it is in fact?
Well, the fights that you do tend to watch on, you know, people tend to, I would say it's pretty 50-50. I mean, you know, there's a decent amount of people who know how to fight out there now, you know, and the other 50% of the guys probably usually get knocked down. So, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think the more you view those types of things, the more that the world becomes more obviously violent to you, I think the more likely you are to turn to violence, to escape or to dominate the situation. Yeah. So yeah, I mean everything changes. You know, nothing stays the same. Right. Yeah, it's probably a bit more dangerous out there like that. But I think it's also less. But if you're trained, I mean, that was one of the things that training with Vladimir really taught me, was like, training to be a fighter is one thing. Training to be a professional is another thing completely. And really these come down to mindsets, you know, and the type of mindset you have really does frame your reality. And if your mindset is that you're a fighter, then you're probably as dangerous to yourself as you are the other person. And training to be a professional is generally just dangerous to the other person. I just think that training to be a professional involves a lot more awareness of the psychology of the fight than just the physicality of it. Yeah, and that's, if someone's good at that, then they don't have to be as good a fighter to be far, far more dangerous.